started. If people could take their seats, please. Thank you. My name is Howard Bachner. I'm editor of JAMA and the JAMA Network. I particularly want to thank the organizers for allowing me to chair this session. It's on data sharing. I think there's few topics that people are more passionate about than sharing data. The discussion really started 4 years ago at the last peer review Congress when Fyfe organized a special session. And I think in pages of many of the clinical journals, it's continued over the last 4 years, largely opinion pieces in many of the journals. I think people know that in February 2016, ICMJE released its first of two concept papers around data sharing. The first was warmly received by the clinical trial community. We received a few hundred comments, and I would say it certainly has provoked a long and interesting discussion, debate about data sharing. I think the one challenge that ICMJE wasn't very clear about in the initial paper in February of 2016 was whether or not, with respect to data sharing, we were focused on the data that underlined the report in question, or whether or not we were talking about sharing of all data that underline a clinical trial. Subsequently, I think people know many issues have arisen. Who's responsible for policing the sharing of data, who supports sharing of data, who hosts sharing of data, who has access to sharing of data, who gets credit for sharing data, and if the original investigators are involved, who supports their time. So many issues. But most of these discussions have occurred without any really important information about data sharing. Some journals have been asked for data sharing agreements for a number of years. Some have insisted on data sharing. PLOS and BMJ Annals has required data sharing clarity and information from authors for a number of years. So I'm really pleased that we have 3 papers that hopefully will begin to shed some light about where we stand with data sharing. The first presenter is Sara Tannenbaum. It's entitled Early Experiences with Journal Data Sharing Policies from Yoda and the BMJ. Sara?
Hi, so thank you for this opportunity to present my abstract on journal data sharing policies. I'd like to thank my co-authors who are up on the screen, as well as Yoda and the BMJ, as he just mentioned, and Yale School of Medicine, where I'm a third-year medical student. Here's just a brief list of our disclosures, a couple that I'd like to highlight. 2 of our co-authors are full-time employees at the BMJ, and a couple of our co-authors receive funding from Johnson & Johnson. So before we discuss medical journal policies, I'd just like to briefly touch on the importance of sharing trial data in general. Proponents have highlighted a few different potential benefits, including ensuring reproducibility of the primary study, the opportunity to explore new questions, the potential to reduce bias, and lastly, to maximize the utility of existing data. But again, what I'm here to talk about is data sharing efforts. So first, we have a list of the different organizations who've participated in data sharing efforts, including pharmaceutical companies who've partnered with third-party organizations to release trial data, the European Medicines Agency, who's released data received in the drug review process, as well as the Institute of Medicine, who in a 2015 report recommended data sharing as a public good. But again, what we're primarily going to focus on today and in this talk is medical journals and medical journal policies. So over the last 5 to 10 years, different individual medical journals have come out with policies either requiring data sharing or requiring data sharing statements. And then these efforts were broadened in 2016, as he just mentioned, when the ICMJE proposed requiring data sharing within 6 months of trial publication. This generated substantial controversy, and then in 2017, there was a new policy put forth that no longer required data sharing, but instead required data sharing statements. As I just alluded to, there's been a fair amount of controversy with regards to data sharing. Opponents have raised several different concerns about data sharing. These are briefly highlighted here. So the first is protecting patient privacy, whether patients gave the authors the right to release their data to third parties. Another is the number of requests received and whether the data sharing resources that are out there are actually being utilized. A third is cost. And lastly is author willingness to share data with people who haven't worked to collect it. And one thing we noticed about all these concerns is a lot of them really focused on the experiences and opinions of the trial authors themselves. And that's what really drove our research question. So because a lot of these concerns really focused on the experiences and opinions of the trial authors, we wanted to know what are the experiences and opinions of trial authors, and especially what are the experiences and opinions of trial authors who published in journals with existing policies. Because as I said, many journals have had policies in place for years. So briefly, our research methods. So we first took a look at the top 10 journals by impact factor. These were general medical journals. And we looked at journals who either required sharing or required data sharing statements. We then looked for studies that were committed to share data, either because their journal required sharing or because they had indicated in their data sharing statement that they were willing to share data. And then we took the corresponding authors of those trials. So in sum, our overall study design was a cross-sectional survey of trial authors in 3 journals, BMJ, PLOS Medicine, and Annals of Internal Medicine. So to these authors, we sent out a web-based survey instrument that asked about questions in sort of 2 categories. The first was experiences with sharing trial data. We asked these questions about the specific trial that we had identified in one of those 3 journals. So we first asked about data sharing plans. Next, we asked about the number of requests received. And then we also asked about real and projected costs of data sharing. The second category of questions was willingness to share data. And to assess that, we used hypothetical scenarios where we asked people, if you received this type of request, would you be willing to share data? So for example, if you received a request to do a meta-analysis, would you grant data to that author? So our results. So overall, we had a 58% response rate. This included 90 trialists across the 3 journals. And now looking at the data sharing preparation steps, we'll start with data sharing plans. So 54% of authors indicated that they had a data sharing plan, but only 29% of authors had a data sharing plan in writing. Moving on to patient consent, 48% did not address data sharing in their patient consent form. And in terms of de-identification, 59% indicated they had a de-identified data set, but only 6% indicated that they had an expert review the de-identification process. So moving on to requests received. So 35% of authors in our sample received a data sharing request. And then we asked authors what the results of those requests were. So if they received a request, was it granted, denied, or undecided? And largely in our sample, if requests received, they were granted. So 90% of authors had all of their requests either granted or undecided, and only 3 authors had denied a data sharing request. Moving on to the costs of data sharing. So among the 25 respondents who had granted a data sharing request, 9 said it took them substantial effort to prepare the data for sharing, and the median time estimate spent was 18 hours. Most people were unable to estimate the monetary cost, but among the 7 people who were able to, they said the cost was mean of $950. And lastly, we asked people, if you received a data sharing request today, how much time would it take you to prepare the data for sharing? And among authors who'd already granted a request, they said it would take them about 8 hours. Among authors who hadn't yet granted a request, they said it would take them 14 hours. And lastly, we have willingness to share data by request type. So these were our hypothetical scenarios where we asked people if they were willing or unwilling to share data in response to a hypothetical data sharing request. These were all for 12 months after publication from a university-based faculty member. So first, starting at the top, was a request to do a meta-analysis. For this, people were generally very willing to share, with 96% of people indicating that they would be willing to share data. To replicate the primary outcome, 73% of people indicated that they would be willing. And then moving on to the 2 other types of studies, the predictive modeling and the secondary outcome studies, if authors were not planning on doing a similar analysis, they were generally very willing to share data, with about 80% of people indicating that they were willing to share. However, if people were planning on doing a similar analysis themselves, this number dropped off significantly. And less than 20% of people were willing to share if they were planning on doing a similar analysis. So moving on to some of the limitations of our study. So there's a social acceptability bias, with people thinking it's more socially acceptable to share data. It was limited to 3 high-impact journals. There was a selection bias, potentially, of people who would be more interested in data sharing, being more likely to respond to the survey, and also a recall bias. So here's our conclusion, sort of broken down by the original concerns people had about data sharing. So first, we have protecting patient privacy. We found that there was probably inadequate preparation for data sharing, with only about 50% of authors taking sort of each preparation step. Next, in terms of requests received, we found that in our sample, people were sharing data, and if people were receiving requests, they were mostly granted. For costs, we found that costs were modest in terms of hours that it would take to respond to a data sharing request. And lastly, for author willingness to share, we found that an intent to publish a similar analysis strongly impacted willingness to share. And finally, the implications of our study. So under medical journal policies, authors are sharing data, but barriers still exist. These barriers include inadequate preparation and trialist unwillingness to share when it conflicts with their own research interests. Future directions could include how to offer recognition to authors for sharing data, how to standardize sharing plans, and lastly, how to ensure compliance with data sharing statements and policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. So we have a bit of extra time for this session, so I see the questions, and we'll start right here.
Yeah, Mark Dewey from Berlin. Excellent, very, very nice talk. I have some doubts about the calculations of costs, because it's often that there is additional questions, you know, what does this really mean? Did you ask the people whether they received funding for data sharing? So did they have to come up with a cost plan for their funding institutions? Did they have a fund for that?
Yeah, so I think we did ask authors a little bit about where they got the funding for the data sharing requests. That was not, we haven't yet analyzed that part of the data, but that will be in the final publication.
So you don't know how many of them had it?
Yeah, I'm not sure at this time.
Okay, because I think that's very valuable, because these people really had to apply for funding, because the numbers that you propose sound a little low to me.
Here?
Theo Bloom from BMJ. Is this on? Yeah, okay. Some years ago, I was involved at PLOS with defining a data sharing policy, along with a number of people who are here today, and may be able to say more about where that went next. But one issue that we stipulated was that the data sharing had to happen at the time of publication. And the reason for that was precisely the 18 hours or 14 hours or whatever, and the money that people said it would cost them to go back retrospectively and prepare their data for publication, and that creating a barrier, and therefore doing it at the time of publication would, you know, get rid of that issue. Now, of course, that meant that all people involved had to do the work, even though some data sets nobody would want, was the argument. You know, why are you penalizing everyone? But I wondered whether the journal editors present, or whether your study told us whether it would be better simply to insist at the time of publication, make it ready for sharing so that you don't have to do the work later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting idea to require it at the beginning. I think it sort of depends on what percentage of authors are receiving data sharing requests. In our sample, it looked like among the people that responded, it was 35%. So in that case, it may be worthwhile to do it up front. But I think that would largely depend on the percentage of people that are receiving requests.
Dr. Lundberg.
George Lundberg from Medscape. When the data include individual patients, de-identified or not, who owns the data?
I mean, I think that's a tough question to answer. I think if the authors had originally asked the patients whether they could share their data, I think that they then, I guess, could potentially own their data. But I think if the patients had not been asked up front whether they have the right to release their data, then that's an ethical question that I think is still yet to be answered.
Katrina McCallum from Hindawi. I have a somewhat cynical question. So you said that authors weren't willing to share if they intended to do a similar analysis to the person requesting the data. Do you have any insight into whether those authors had thought of that analysis before the requester suggested it to them?
So that data was from the hypothetical scenarios, so I don't know. It wasn't about a specific request that had been made, so yeah.
In the back.
Hi, Anwen Chan, University of Toronto. Great presentation. A couple of questions. First one, how many of the trials were industry sponsored, and were any of the barriers that were conveyed in the survey related to concerns over an industry sponsor restricting data sharing? And then secondly, which sort of relates to a previous question, do you think in the future, if sharing of data becomes the norm, that it may become easier, less costly, less time-consuming if processes were built in from the start when a data form is designed with a data dictionary and so on, that it may become built in so that at the end, data sharing won't be so onerous?
Yeah, so in response to your first question about industry sponsoring, a small percentage of the studies were industry sponsored. I think about five of the trials were totally funded by industry, and then an additional number had a mixed funding source. In terms of why people denied data sharing requests, so there were only actually 4 trials that had a data sharing request that was denied. And so for those, there were 4 trials that had, or 4 requests that were denied for 3 trials. And so among those, 3 out of the 4 cited concerns over appropriate data usage. I don't remember anyone citing specifically industry regulations or anything like that. And then, sorry, to address your second question, which I think was sort of similar to the earlier one about which of these steps should be done up front versus later on. I think as more data sharing happens and a greater percentage of authors are receiving requests, it may make sense to do more of these steps up front and maybe more cost effective and more streamlined.
Thank you. Time for 2 more questions in the back and then the front. We'll do the back first.
Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting presentation, Veronique Kiermer with PLOS. I think it's fascinating because you've gone to people who are at least willing to share, and so I think it's a very important step forward in thinking about the objectives. The striking results I find is this question about patient privacy. That's something that, in our experience at PLOS, this is something we go back and forth with the authors a lot. As Theo mentioned, this is something we ask at the time of publication, so we want to make sure there is a mechanism in place. And I think the observation I have here is that there are not many mechanisms in place, or they are not very common. And I think your data shows that. There's not necessarily an informed consent where this is built in. There's not necessarily a data access committee set up somewhere. So in view of decreasing costs, working on these barriers, which are very real barriers, I think it's very important. And I just wanted to, I think your data suggests that. I don't know if you have any further comments, qualitative comments from the people you surveyed about that, but it seems striking.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question, and Fee, you do get special dispensation, so we'll do one more question after this. Hold on, could you turn that mic on? Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, Brooks Hansen, HEO. So I don't work in clinical trials, we work in geology. But in response to the earlier question, I think there's very good evidence that if data are not available at publication, it becomes unavailable later on. And since the data availability is critical for the integrity of that research and the public confidence in that, as well as the researcher confidence, why isn't it, why are these journals not requiring at publication? Which is getting back to the PLOS question, and that's our policy and many others for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the journal editors and stuff like that about why it's not required, but I do think it's definitely an interesting idea to think about how to offer, like make it more upfront and more streamlined so to prevent it from being lost later on.
Okay. Dr. Godley.
Thanks, Howard. Sorry to add this on. I was interested that you caught the fact, or you commented on the fact that the backtracking, which I think it was backtracking from the ICMJ policy planned in a year ago and the one we've just recently published, was driven by trialists' concerns. I think we would all agree that was the case. And I think what we have failed to do is hear enough from the public and patients. The voice of trialists is very loud, and they are the experts in this, and the patients and public didn't get much of a look in my view. I may be wrong, Howard may say different, and others. But I think that one of the problems has been we haven't really shown really clear evidence of benefit, and there's a concern about proportionality, that this is going to be very costly and difficult, and we need to kind of make the case that actually what are the benefits, which your study I think is going to help to do. And so that's one thing, is let's try and really nail the case for doing this. What are the examples of when data sharing has really changed the answer or has prevented a misconduct of some sort, or highlighted misconduct? I think we've got some good cases. And the second point is that the other issue that was definitely, it comes up just only at the end of your presentation, is about credit to the original data holder, and how do we allow that? And I think the BMJ were beginning to think about having a routine statement and acknowledgements to say these data, you know, the original data have come from such and such a place. So we make that normal, so people have to, you know, that's just maybe a little next baby step to crediting the original data holders. I just wondered if you could put that point high up in your list of concerns, because you've got 4 concerns, but lack of credit is one of them, I think, a 5th.
Thank you. Sara, just one quick question. I know we're short of time. Do you have a sense if investigators are making decisions to share data without an ethics committee approval or without an individual patient consent at the time of enrollment in a clinical trial? So my practice before I came to JAMA was at Boston, the old Boston City Hospital, Boston Medical Center, and they're incredibly protective because of the type of patients we took care of there about sharing data, even if the investigator believes it's de-identified. Because oftentimes investigators may believe it's de-identified when in fact it's not de-identified. So did you have a sense that these people would agree to share data without an ethics committee indicating that they could share data?
So we didn't ask them specifically about an ethics committee. We did ask them, as we presented, about whether they had a de-identified data set, whether it had been reviewed by an expert, and I think the fact that only 6% had an expert reviewed de-identification process was somewhat concerning, as you said, for actually de-identifying the data. And then 48% did not address it in the patient consent form, so that's also somewhat concerning, but we didn't ask them specifically about like an ethics board approval for data sharing.
Right, thanks so much, Sara. Yeah. Okay, we'll go to the next presentation. Sharing data through the Yoda project, one of the great names of any new project I've ever heard. God knows that's worth a fortune, that Yoda project. Early experiences by Joe Ross and colleagues. Go ahead, Joe.
Someone should have trademarked that name.
You should have trademarked it.
Thank you, Carrie Gross, who's here, who came up with that name. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about the Yoda project, which is the Yale Open Data Access Project. I am here among a representative of several who've spent a lot of time and effort in launching this, including Harlan Krumholtz in the back, Carrie Gross in the back, and many others. So I'll take your hard questions, but you should congratulate them as well. So just in the interest of full disclosure, the Yoda project is funded by a research grant through Yale from Johnson & Johnson, and we were formerly funded by Medtronic. And I've also received research grant funding from the FDA, CMS, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. And also I'm an associate editor at JAMA Internal Medicine. Should have put that on. So 50% of clinical trials are never published. This is not a fact that's unsurprising to many people in this room. And even those that are published after long delays, many after more than 2 years. Even when they are published, only a limited portion of the collected data is reported, particularly for secondary endpoints, safety details that never make it into the primary publication, or even any of the secondary publications. This, of course, is a problem in clinical practice. It makes it so patients and physicians are frequently in the position of making treatment decisions that are based on only a fraction of the potentially available clinical data that could have informed that decision. And so we need to find ways to improve publication and reporting of research. And I would be remiss not to mention, with Deb Zarin sitting next to me on the panel, the importance of publishing and reporting results in ClinicalTrials.gov. Everyone, report, report, report. But more can be done to strengthen the scientific enterprise if we were also to consider data sharing. And the Institute of Medicine spent a long time deliberating on this question over the past 4 to 5 years. They released a report now probably a year and a half ago on sharing clinical trial data. And at the top line, right, sharing data ensures that all data are being used to inform clinical decisions. But there's more to it than that. It positions research as a public good. It respects the contributions of all the participants, including maximizing the value of collected data by making it available to others for other additional research questions, while minimizing the duplicative data collection. And this can't be said enough. If large data sets are made available for others to use, it prevents the need to enroll patients in new trials as part of their education and training curriculum. In many ways, it facilitates secondary studies of existing data. This can be to look at rare outcomes. This can be meta-analyses. It can be reanalyzing data to validate the original findings. And at the very least, it also promotes transparency and reproducibility, both in the sample and the design and the analysis, because you can learn more by looking through the data set than you could just learn by looking at the registration. And Fee just asked about examples of how is science strengthened, examples of where data sharing. For those of you who like podcasts, there was just a terrific one by Malcolm Gladwell on revisionist history, where he talked about unearthing this data set that had not been published, a clinical trial of a diet. After 40 years, BMJ published the paper 40 years after, and we learned a lot from this really technically well-done study, and of course, Malcolm Gladwell tells the story better than I would. In response to these concerns around data sharing, our group launched what we call the Yoda project, and this is our homepage. And the purpose of this talk today is really to describe our early experience with setting up the project, sharing clinical research data through it, and hopefully others can learn from that experience. So when we launched the Yoda project, we start with trying to identify what our statement of principles would be. And after much back and forth among the project team, we identified these 4 key principles around which the entire project is based. We wanted to promote the sharing of clinical research data to advance science and improve public health and healthcare. We wanted to promote the responsible conduct of research. We wanted to ensure good stewardship of clinical research data by external investigators, and we wanted to protect the rights of research participants. So, and all of the decisions that we've made have been to echo these 4 principles. So we started sharing data actually back in 2011, or approximately, that's when the Yoda project was launched, long before the Institute of Medicine was taking on this question. And this partnership grew about, Medtronic had a product about which safety concerns had been raised. This product called Infuse, which is a biologic that's sort of put on a medical device inserted in the spine to promote bone growth. And we said to them, we formed this project around essentially reanalyzing their patient-level data. And the effort was really focused on soliciting, through a competitive mechanism, 2 independent groups that were going to take all this clinical trial data, reanalyze it on themselves, come to the conclusions about the safety and efficacy of the product. And then after that was done, we would make the data available to others. So this both provided 2 high-quality reviews that were conducted in tandem, published simultaneously, actually eventually in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And the goal was to sort of provide public assurance through the independent review and reanalysis. But the data access policy was the beginning of sort of thinking about what we could do to promote data sharing later on. And we convened a steering committee, also included Deb Zarin and others, experts in biostatistics and clinical trial design and clinical trial policy, where we set a policy that required registration and public reporting and publication. Anyone could apply to use this data. There were 4 requests over the time that it was available, and we had 2 completed projects that were both published in the literature. But the Yoda project really gained momentum when we began a partnership with Johnson & Johnson, and this is really our sort of signature initiative at this point. This was initiated in 2014, and there was no concern about getting people to reanalyze the data. This was all about, in a sort of systematic way. This instead was an effort that was focused on promoting and facilitating access to clinical trial data. And this was all pharmaceutical products, including legacy trials, so trials that had happened in the past, they were willing to go back and make available. It included device and diagnostic products as of 2015, and actually consumer products as of 2017. And we maintained this governance structure with a formal steering committee. We revised our access policies. We set up very formal procedures, all of which were made publicly available through others soliciting comments from experts, other stakeholders, and even the public. We put out a public call for comments. And then we launched the Yoda Project website, and that's where you go to find information about the trials and information on the metadata that's affiliated with it and essentially what's available. So this is a trial page. If you go to our website, this is what you would see. It lists the trial. It provides links to a CSR summary that's made available by Johnson & Johnson, to the clinical trials registration number, to the primary citation. It includes other information, including what the product is used for, the size of the trial, other supporting documentation, and information like that. And we are actually now going back, we thought that to make the site even more useful to potential requesters, we're not going to only have the enrollment number, but we're also going to have the mean age and the proportion that are women and the portion that are minority in order to facilitate that type of subgroup research, because it's hard to know, who is in the study just from this page. We require an application when somebody wants to use the data, and this is pretty simple. It's the investigator's name, their affiliation. They have to provide a narrative summary of the project, a public abstract, and then a fairly detailed research proposal. They tend to be between 2 and 4 pages. We had always called it a 1-pager, but people provide enough information that I would call it a 2 to 3-pager. It provides background, the significance and objectives of the work, the study design, main outcomes, and a statistical analysis plan, along with a conflict of interest statement. This application is then reviewed by at least 3 members of the Yoda Project team who often provide comments back to the requester and then make a decision about whether or not to approve it. And once approved, a data use agreement is required that stipulates what can be done with the data, that you can't re-identify patients as part of the project, the data has to remain secured and can't be redistributed. All data are maintained on a secure platform that's currently managed by SAS. And investigators access it via a virtual network, a VPN. And this prevents distribution and protects patient privacy. So we started making data available in around 2014, and you can see the number of requests has steadily risen. We get anywhere between 5 and 10 a quarter, and we're now at about 80 overall requests. The median number of trials that are requested in any individual request is 3. Very few, about a quarter, are just for one. Mostly people want multiple trials as part of a request. We've had some come in for more than 40 or 50 trials, and those tend to be more methodological projects. And we made sure everything is publicly available and transparent. So every decision we make, every trial that's available, it's all listed on our website. So any approved request that comes in, we report that on our website. We provide the information. We provide a link to their research proposal so that someone who's then later on evaluating the request or looking at the publication that results from it can see what was pre-specified as part of the work. Of the 78 that we've received so far, 91% have been approved, 1 remains under review, and 6 were withdrawn or closed. And this usually means that somebody put in a request for data that wasn't available within the trial. So they wanted to use scans or images that the company couldn't properly identify or make available, or they wanted pharmacokinetic information that hadn't been collected as part of the original trial. Nearly all of the requests that come in do require some administrative revision. So this takes time on the part of our staff. But what I think is kind of interesting is about a third have required scientific revisions after our review. So they come in and we're looking to approve every request. We want to make this data available to as many people as possible. And there are times we get requests that we just can't understand the methods. And so we have to provide not necessarily very detailed comments, but we have to go back to them and ask for revisions so that someone could then later look at it and understand enough of what they were trying to do to evaluate their project. The most common reasons that people request data is usually to look at a new secondary aim or meta-analysis, and there's been now about 20 that have said they've wanted to validate the findings of prior research. And thus far, of the 71 that have been approved, 2 have completed their projects which have been published, 4 are currently under peer review. and 7 were discontinued. And I think this is actually kind of interesting, because what happens is people get access to the data, they go through all the steps, they jump through the hoops, they sign the data use agreement, everything goes okay, and then they start to work on the server, the SaaS server, and they realize that it's more complicated to work with data than they realize. And it's not just a simple pressing of buttons, and they get frustrated. 1 minute. So, I'm actually just about finished. So, this is our story. This is sort of what we've understood with the Yoda project. There are other data repositories out there that are sharing data. These are the 2 best known. BioLink, which is managed by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, has been making data available for years and years. And there's another multi-sponsor clinical trial environment of industry called ClinicalStudyDataRequest.com that also has been making data available. And I think this is sort of where the conversation is to go. This is the challenges that are ahead for us. We need to now, we've shown that we can share data, but now we need to figure out what are the best practices to adopt among these data sharing platforms. What facilitates the use most easily? What about these data analytics servers, which questioners find difficult to work with? And what metadata are needed to best facilitate and make use of the data? Question that Howard raised before, who should pay for this? Right now, industry is paying for it. They're paying to make their data available for others to use. Is that the right model, or is that a sustainable model? And what we have found particularly frustrating is engaging the research community to use the data and to understand that using it is complicated. It's all well and good for us to do all of this work and make data available, but if no one's going to come and use it, we haven't succeeded in our work. And there's lots of challenges around data use agreements and how long data should be made available, and how to encourage others beyond the large pharmaceutical companies or the other big funders that are doing this now, particularly at academic medical centers. And then, of course, there's the challenge that the Institute of Medicine spent a fair bit of time talking about, which is what are the incentives for sharers and users that will promote the greatest success. So I just want to thank all of the people that have been involved in this, and I would encourage you all to go to our website and learn more about the trials that we are making available. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Joe's paper's open for questions. See if someone's coming to the mic. Nope. Joe, can you go back to slide 11?
Tell me, I don't see the numbers, so you gotta tell me when it's 11.
Oh, keep going. It's the one with the data right there. Stop. It appears to me here that actually the number of requests are going down. Am I misreading this?
Well, I don't know if it's going down. It sort of hovers between 5 and 10. I don't think there's really a strong trend there. But we did have a couple of good months where there were 9, 3 months in a row.
Okay. Question over here.
Hi, yeah, I'm Stephanie Kinnan. I work for a medical journal, and recently we've been discussing some of the ethical concerns about data sharing. Obviously, we want to encourage it, but we're concerned about, when does it become duplicate publication when you have multiple groups using the same, let's say, patient set to produce studies. And we're just kind of wondering, like, what would be a good policy? Obviously, that's something at least we need to disclose, and I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I would turn to the journal sort of what counts as duplicate publication. My thinking on it is that if it's the same group publishing the same study twice, that's a duplicate publication. But if it's 2 different groups working with the data, one replicating the other, that's science. I mean, that's the key, right? Sort of replicating the methods and the results and making sure people find the same things. So I wouldn't consider that duplicate publication. But it does raise this question. When data sets are made available, what are the cuts and slivers, and when is it okay? When is something important enough? When is it novel enough? But we do have a lot of experience with that. I mean, the National Center for Health Statistics has been making survey data available for 50 years that numerous investigators have used to ask numerous different questions, and we've never really run into this type of problem.
Right here, we have time for just the people at the microphones, right here.
Scott Lemare from Baylor College of Medicine and the Journal of Surgical Research. You raised the issue of who's going to pay for this. Can you tell us what was the cost to set up this elaborate, fantastic infrastructure, and what's the annual cost of maintaining it?
Just short answers, Jim.
Yeah, so I can talk to you more about the actual cost. I can assure you that the cost for the SaaS analytics server is far more than the cost for us to set up a website and maintain our enrollment. And that's been the biggest challenge as we've tried to engage with the big trial funders, is that they don't want to pay for this SaaS infrastructure.
And the personnel and all as well?
It's less than 1 FTE.
Okay, Lisa and then Doug, and then we'll stop. Lisa, go ahead.
Lisa Barrow. I completely agree with what you said about the data being hard to use, and particularly when you're going post hoc like that, and that's why when people do an individual patient data meta-analysis, they try to collect the data in a format where it can all be used prospectively. But I guess I'm wondering, because I am a little cynical, whether that data is sometimes deliberately difficult to use, and that's just based on experience we've had getting data from a pharmaceutical trade organization who had it available in 2 formats, one that was easy to use and one that wasn't, and we were given the one that was not easy to use.
Yeah, so I share your cynicism, and I've been there on both sides. So I can tell you that in the data that we've used, actually, so we've requested data through clinicalstudydatarequest.com, which was data from GSK, and it was actually pretty easy. I mean, it's challenging if you've never worked with data before, because it comes to the FDA in 14 different files, one for demographics and one for the first year follow-up and one for the second. And so it's messy to sort of merge, but if you know what you're doing, it's not so bad. I think at least right now, the groups that are sharing data are trying to do it in a way that makes it more easy to use, not harder.
Last question in the back, Doug.
Yeah, Doug Altman, University of Oxford. I'm on the committee that reviews the applications for the clinical study data requests, which you mentioned. My question is, on what grounds would you reject an application?
So we have 2 stipulations. You can't use the data for commercial purposes, and you can't use the data as part of, like pursuant of litigation. If someone can justify that they're using the data to address a generalizable scientific or public health question, we are trying to make sure, we're trying to give them access to the data. We have a very low bar, and that's deliberate.
Right. Thanks, Joe. All right, thanks, Joe. We'll go on to the next speaker. The next speaker is Deb Zarin, but before we start, when trial registration began almost more than 10 years ago, it was a really good idea amongst ICMJE journal and journal editors, but we needed a mechanism to do it. And I think the person standing to my left is more responsible than any individual in the world for making sure that happened, and I think it should really be acknowledged that she's really spent a decade of her life ensuring that the reporting of clinical trials improves, and it's really a pleasure to have Deb here. The title of her presentation is Statements About Intent to Share IPD at ClinicalTrials.gov. Deb Zarin.
Thank you. Since you were so nice in that, can I ask to sit there? Because I can't,
Sure.
I'm vertically challenged and I can't see the...
Right ahead.
Thank you. This is awesome. Now I can see it. Sorry if I can't see people over there. So where's the clicker? How do I do this? Green goes forward. Okay, it's a good guess. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about what we've learned at ClinicalTrials.gov about sharing of IPD. This is just to give you a context for the data I'm going to present, and others have gone over this, so I'll just say that we collected data. I'm going to show you data from ClinicalTrials.gov between January of 2016 and just a few weeks ago in August. So this spans the time when the ICMJE proposed their policy, and it includes the time when they announced their policy as well. So, I should go back a second, sorry. So at ClinicalTrials.gov, in response to requests from the ICMJE, we added two data elements in December of 2015 that would allow people to say whether they had a plan to share IPD. So at the time of registration, or really any time, someone who was registering a clinical study could say yes, no, undecided about whether they plan to share participant level data. The data element has what we thought was a very clear definition of what was meant by IPD, and a clear definition of what was meant by sharing in terms of enabling a third party to use the data for research. So I'm going to be giving data about our experience with that particular question. We also added a question at the same time so that people who had finished where their trials had completed could say whether IPD or relevant study documents were available and insert the links. There's always been the ability to insert links, so we have links to Yoda from J&J, from Medtronic trials, have links to Yoda, we have links to BioLink, but this was providing a structure for the first time in ClinicalTrials.gov where you could put a link to your IPD. So these are the data. There much more detail about the study is in the abstract. And just look at the fact that this was an optional question in ClinicalTrials.gov, so there was no legal or other mandate to answer this question, and yet nearly 3/4 of the people who registered their study during that 20-month period answered it, which is kind of unheard of. We never get that many people answering a question that's optional, and it was maybe because we shaded the fact that it was optional, I'm not sure. So look at the row that says yes, and this is to emphasize that the two talks you just heard from were talking about a rarefied environment. Sara talked about 3 leading medical journals and the people who had gotten their publications in those journals. And Joe talked about companies who had sought out the ability to use Yoda to share their data. And at ClinicalTrials.gov, you could think of this as the unwashed masses. So of the 25,000 trials that had answered this question, that responded to the question, 11% said yes, they do have a plan to share IPD at the end of their study. And 64% said no. This is overall. The careful readers in the audience will notice that those numbers are slightly worse than the numbers in the abstract. And that's because the additional 6 months of data that we have here, but don't have in the abstract, made the data a little bit worse. So it's not as if recently you're getting more yeses and fewer no's, you're in fact getting more no's and fewer yeses. So this is a sense of where things are at with the general clinical trial community as opposed to those who are publishing in the leading journals. Excuse me. And now, for those 11% who said yeses, we have evidence that many of them actually didn't know what they were saying. Because we asked for an option. Sorry, this is the world we live in. We asked for an optional question about, give us a description of your plan. We've since added more structure to that, but I'll get to that in a minute. So one person or one clinical trialist said through peer-reviewed publications. Another said that it'll be posted publicly on a clinical trial registry, which makes you think that they're not really talking about IPD in the same way we are. The emphasis in all scientific publications will be placed on the 1-year endpoint, which is kind of neither here nor there. And then occasionally they said something that was very specific to IPD. So this gives us pause in terms of the level of education and knowledge and awareness in the clinical trial community. In terms of those during that 20-month period that have, again, optionally provided links to either IPD or to associated documents, we've gotten about over 100 trials have given us those links with about 212 different documents. 19 of those include links to the IPD data set. I will say that this is in the structured data element. We have many, probably a few hundred studies in there with links to IPD in their study record, like we have the links to Yoda and the links to BioLink, et cetera. But of these 19, 12 had said that they weren't going to share IPD. So that's fair, though, because you can have a plan, not have a plan to share it, and then in the end share it. But it's sort of all over the place. I will add, however, that this is actually getting to be a reasonable resource for those researchers who want to find study documents, because this is growing. So the key findings from that little study are that there seems to be a lack of clarity about what constitutes IPD among the clinical research community. Again, not the research community who comes to this meeting or who publishes in the journals that are probably represented in this room, but the overall research community. Many organizations, I didn't present this data, it's described in the abstract. If you look by organization, many have no current IPD data sharing plans for any of their trials, including most of the industry. So people think, oh, industry is ahead of academia. And that's because there are some companies, more than some, many companies that have data sharing plans, but the vast majority don't have any data sharing plans, at least in terms of how they answer this question. Proposals for requiring IPD sharing will require widespread changes within the clinical research enterprise. And ClinicalTrials.gov could provide a centralized information scaffold, and this is a slide that many of you have seen where we're trying to encourage people to actually answer these optional data elements, not just because the ICMJE is now requiring them to do it, but because we think ClinicalTrials.gov provides a useful place to find this information about the clinical trials. So I have a few minutes. I'm going to just say a few other things. One is, some of you have seen this, but in terms of what is IPD, everything, this is a graphic that's supposed to show what happens to data from the time you collect it on the far left, the uncoded data like the case report form, all the way to when you analyze it and then report the summary data. So everything that's not shaded on the far right is technically IPD, but the value and the quality and the meaning of that data varies by where it is along that sort of journey. So think about what would be the IPD underlying the outcome of progression-free survival. So progression-free survival is a very common outcome measure. I forget what percentage of oncology studies in ClinicalTrials.gov have it as a primary, but it's a large percentage. It's frequently reported as here as the median progression-free survival with some range around it, in this case a confidence interval. So what would be the IPD underlying that? Well, it's hard to know because progression-free survival is time to event, the event being progression. So literally, do you just want the time for each participant, or do you want to understand what counted as progression, which could be 3 different things? It could be a change in tumor size of the original tumor, the index tumor, it could be another site, another lesion, or it could be death. And there's all sorts of detailed data that you would actually want for each of those things, and what would be meaningful. There's ways of providing IPD, in other words, that wouldn't be particularly meaningful, and other ways of providing it that would be more meaningful. So I think, again, as a research community, we need to think about that. Then I'll just mention that a new change in ClinicalTrials.gov is as of 2 months ago, I think. We now allow for and in fact require the upload of the PDF of the protocol and statistical analysis plan at the time of results reporting in ClinicalTrials.gov, and allow it optionally any time earlier, including at registration. We also allow for the uploading of a PDF of the informed consent form, and we're very happy about these changes. And we are getting many of these documents, and this is another good place to find these documents if anyone wants to do meta research on these documents that previously have been somewhat hard to find. This is where you can find them in the bottom of the registry record under a section called Study Documents. And then finally, our plan is to add an advanced search option, a structured option to find studies that have either uploaded documents, like I just said, or links to IPD and links to the data set. So we encourage people to use these data for that. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Deb. Questions for Deb Zarin about her data that she just presented? She always has big, big numbers whenever she presents, like giant numbers. Okay. So, Deb, you have a somewhat different perspective than I think many people in this room. You've been at the registry for over a decade. It's been critical in improving the reporting of clinical trials. To educate a clinical trials community, what are the 1, 2, 3 things that you think we need to do so that sharing of data becomes the norm and not the exception?
Let's see. Well, first I found it dismaying that 12 years after the ICMJE policy about trial registration was implemented, at the peer review Congress 12 years ago, it was just about to go into effect. That September 12th deadline was coming up. There was still some debate this morning about whether anyone should care about trial registration. So I think that we've published this pyramid where I think the trial registration is critical as the foundation for both transparency and ensuring or allowing for the integrity of the entire research enterprise. So focusing on trial registration as the foundation of the pyramid, and then summary results reporting, and I would say both in ClinicalTrials.gov and in a journal, and the journal allows for discussion and explanation and other things that sometimes border into what some might call spin, but sometimes don't. And then the IPD is the cherry on the top of that. So I think it's very important, but it's the most important thing is trial registration, then the summary results, then IPD. And the final thing I'd say is that we are finding, I don't know if they're islands or if they're whole continents of the clinical research community, and this will be shocking to many in this room, who don't even have protocols. Like there are portions of NIH-funded people doing clinical trials that do not have the scientific culture of having even a protocol. So I think that there's a whole promulgation of scientific standards that needs to go on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Deb, and I want to thank each of the speakers, Sara, Joe, and Deb Zarin, and I'm pleased to turn over the podium to Drummond Rennie. Thank you.
The three historical papers given at the first 1989 peer-reviewed Congress by Kronig, Burnham, and then our Elizabeth Noel have been widely quoted and seem important, at any rate to scientists interested in how we got to here with peer review. I give an introduction to Professor Fyfe simply to tell you that fact, but also to prepare you to meet a strange beast from another part of the academic forest. She has been a historian of science and technology, interested in scientific publishing particularly. She trained at Cambridge, of course. She worked in Galway for a decade and has been at St. Andrews since 2011, and there she is as a professor. She focused on the mid-19th century, but she now finds herself investigating an entire 350 years of scientific journal publishing and bringing an historical perspective to help us understand why academic publishing currently works the way it does. Her talk is The Social Dynamics and Structural Bias in Peer Review, or 1865 to 1965. Professor Fyfe.
Thank you, Drummond. And I need to reacquire that. Okay, so as my title says, I'm going to be looking at the history of peer review. In fact, I'm going to be talking about the history of peer review in the century before that term even came into existence. I'm talking about a period before the 1960s and 70s when peer review as a phrase was coined. Now, of course, there was something that has some similarities to peer review before the 1960s and 70s. The practice of seeking confidential written reports from external experts had been around, well, for how long? Certainly late 18th century, early 19th century, depends what you think is important. But anyway, had been around for a while before that. So I can talk about a history of peer review before that, but I will mostly be calling it refereeing because that's the more historically accurate term. But what's really interesting for the purpose of this paper, I think, is that refereeing, as it was practiced in that earlier century, was very specifically associated with certain types of journals. It was something that was found mostly in journals published by learned societies. In other words, refereeing was a practice that was developed in the context of communities of scholars. It was not a practice that was widely used by journals run by editors, single editors, one person in charge. It's something associated with communities. So that's what I'm interested in today, that question about the communities of scholars behind refereeing, and what social structures, what social dynamics, and what biases might be built in because of the nature of that community. Now, I have spent the last 4, or maybe it's 5 years of my life working on a project on the world's longest running scientific journal. It's the Philosophical Transactions, and it's been going for 350 years, which means that I'm vastly outside my normal comfort zone looking at things that are much older than I normally look at. Anyway, my team and I have been exploring the correspondence, the committee minute books, the referee reports that still exist in the archive of the Royal Society in London. And it's an amazing archive for any of you who are at all interested in historical scientific material. And we're not only interested in the history of peer review, we're also interested in a range of questions about how journals were organized and managed in the past. But obviously here I'm talking about the peer review side of things. Now, most of the graphs that I'm going to be sharing with you today, and you know, I don't normally do graphs, but I have actually quite recently been doing some, I find fascinating work with some collaborators that gives me all these graphs to talk about. So I've felt coming to this Congress that I would take the opportunity to share some of my graphs. Anyway, the graphs come from this, whoops, wrong way, hang on, sorry, from this data set. This is a series of handwritten ledgers that still survive in the Royal Society archives. It's called the Register of Papers, and you can think of it as a paper-based editorial management system. In other words, it's a record of every paper that was submitted to the Society with its title, its author, the date received, the date it was sent to referees, the names of the referees, if there were any, and the date the decision was made, and the final outcome. So you can actually glance down the right-hand page, and the column that quite often doesn't have very much in it is the names of the referees, and we'll come back to why that is in a moment. Anyway, that is a manuscript form. There's lots of data in it, and what we're working with today is 5-year samples that have been transcribed from that into a database. So I've got a whole year's worth of stuff for every 5 years between 1865 and 1965, and that's partly why the dates for my talk is as they are. But there is another reason for looking at that late 19th and early 20th century period, because it was a time of significant change and growth in the scientific community. So one of the things I'm interested in is looking at how those changes in the practice of scientific research, in the scale and scope of scientific research, how those things then affected editorial systems, including the practice of refereeing. So the first thing we see when we look at those every 5-year samples is a picture of what the growth actually looks like in terms of submissions to the Royal Society. The total bar is the number of submissions received. All the graphs in this format that you're going to see start in 1865 and end in 1965. So if you're worrying about the scale later on, if I haven't labelled them in big enough font, that's what they are. So there's growth across the first half of that. But you'll notice that it's biggest in the period, basically 3 decades at the start of the 20th century, when we're looking at a roughly ×3 growth between about 1890 and 1930. You can recognize where the Second World War is, because that's the big dip on the right-hand side. So we've got a society that's dealing with 3 times more submissions coming in, and the society itself hasn't grown in size, which is also significant. One of the immediate effects of all this growth was that the Society's secondary journal, which was originally an abstract journal called Proceedings, was transformed into a full-blown research journal because the original transactions essentially couldn't cope with all this material. So what we're seeing is an early example of one journal spinning off a sister journal. I mean, nowadays, of course, we have plenty of examples of more than one sister journal being spun off. But this is one response to the scale of science. Another interesting thing that comes out, I think, of these early results is when we look at where those extra papers were coming from. So in the late 19th century, most of the papers being submitted were coming from members of the society, those fellows. So that's the green line. It's the upper, on the left-hand side, that's the upper line. But the big growth is really coming from submissions from outsiders, the blue line. And of course, at some point, they cross. So from that point onwards, we've got a scenario where the majority of papers being submitted are from people who are not members of the society. And that creates some interesting dynamics for the editorial process, as you will see in a little bit. So the growth is largely coming from people outside that community. So bear that in mind. So you can see why there's some increased strain on the editorial system with all these extra papers coming in. But there's actually another reason why there's a problem with the editorial system in this, and that is because, maybe I shouldn't hold it down here. The Royal Society itself also started to use refereeing more often. So although it had been doing refereeing since the 1830s, it had mostly been doing it for papers published in the transactions, the lengthy, well-illustrated, and actually expensive to produce papers. They were the ones that tended to go to referees. In green on this, you see the proportion of papers that did not go to any referees at all. And you can see that that proportion declines quite dramatically over this period. So by the time we get to the 1930s, pretty much every paper submitted to the Royal Society, with a few exceptions, was going to referees. And in fact, a small number were even going to 3 or more referees, the blue ones at the top. So we've got more papers coming in, and more of them going to referees. So you can tell that means more referee reports needing to be written, and there are bundles and bundles of them in the Royal Society archive. Just so you know what they look like, you can see that they also developed in this period from being freehand written reports on the left to a standardized referee report form that was filled out. I was looking at those earlier and thinking, and I wonder if they also got shorter over this period. But since they're all in manuscript, it's kind of difficult to do other than by my gut instinct. There were some very long reports in the early period. Later on, there are less often long reports. But unless someone's going to digitize this whole lot for me, I can't run you those figures. So, lots more reports needing to be written. And by the way, more committee work to decide on choosing the referees and discussing their recommendations. This is all going to put a strain on the Society's editorial processes by the middle years of the 20th century. So I should, before going any further, tell you a bit about what these editorial processes actually were. So that is my schematic of what the editorial process looked like at the Society round about 1900. If you're thinking that looks complicated, I'll point out it was never designed that way. It is something that has evolved over time. When the Society took over the transactions in 1752, one of the first things it did was replace a sole editor with an editorial committee, and that's the committee of papers that you see roughly in the center of this diagram. They felt that it would be less risk to the reputation of the Society to have a committee involved rather than one individual who could be incompetent or just ill long term. So a committee was thought to be better. But over the years, extra things accumulated to this process. So from 1830s, we've got referees helping out, and from the 1890s, we've also got disciplinary subcommittees who are providing advice on the selection of referees. And that's all the more necessary, I should say, because both the transactions and the proceedings are quite unusual journals in that they cover the full range of natural sciences. They don't cover just one specific discipline. So that does make certain challenges in the editorial process as well. It's part of the reason why it might have been difficult to have a single editor in charge of them. Anyway, looking at this, I hope you see that there's lots of stages involved in the process, and therefore lots of people involved in the process. And that's where my social dynamics come from. People, lots of people, okay? And a key point about all these people is that except for authors, who could not be fellows, everyone else involved in this editorial process is by definition a fellow of the Royal Society. So this is a closed editorial club, if you will. And that's a very specific sort of club with very particular characteristics, which I'm going to tell you more about. I'm going to specifically tell you right now about two aspects of this. One is who's in that club, and the other one is that communicator role that you see up in the top left, a kind of gatekeeper. But let's start with who's in the community. So, there's certain things we can say about the people who were doing the refereeing in the 19th century, the early 20th century. I know this is technically an earlier picture, but there are very few surviving pictures of Fellows of the Royal Society, and this is one of them. Fellows of the Royal Society, therefore referees, were all people who had demonstrated a certain level of research achievement. They were not merely active researchers, but they were at a certain point in their career. Very few of them, for instance, were under the age of 40. There were also people who, you could argue, would share a sense, we hope, of commitment, of responsibility, of loyalty to the institution to which they all belonged. There were hopefully also people, and also, because being a Fellow of the Royal Society in this period did not simply mean getting those prestigious letters, FRS, after your name. It also meant going to meetings, like the one you see here. It meant going to the annual soirees and social events. It meant doing a lot of committee work, quite likely. In other words, it meant meeting up with other fellows of the society. And that's significant because it means that this is a group of people who knew each other, some of them better than others, of course, but they knew each other, be socialized in certain behaviors, whether that is about what the appropriate tone for discussion after an academic paper might be, or about what counts as interesting or good research, or indeed about how to behave in a suitably gentlemanly fashion to the ladies at the social events. But there are certain shared social characteristics of this group because they all meet up and get to know each other. I think that's important. Now, some of these characteristics you might see as being quite valuable things for an editorial team. The fact that they have got a certain level of research competency and achievement, the fact that they are going to be loyal to the institution and that therefore they're going to be willing to write their reviews, we assume. The fact that they might share some ideas about what's worthy of being published could all help them work as an efficient editorial team, we would hope. However, you may have noticed from the picture that is up there, I hope you'll certainly notice from this picture 100 years later, there was something of a lack of diversity among the fellowship of the Royal Society. Okay? Yeah, admittedly this is just the physicists, but I'm afraid the biologists aren't that much better. Although papers could be submitted to the Royal Society by theoretically anybody, or any gender, any age, any nationality, they were being judged and decided upon by people who were generally white, male, based in Britain, and at least 40 years old, such as the gentleman in this room. And what I particularly like about this meeting of the officers in 1950 is the fact that you see the living officers there, but they're meeting under the oil portraits of their predecessors, who are similarly lacking in diversity. So given what we all know nowadays about implicit biases, you can see there might be some issues about what could be presented as a perfectly sensible solution of having expert, experienced judges making these decisions. But we imagine there may be some structural biases to setting up your editorial community in that way, particularly biases against outsiders. And there are, of course, a range of ways in which you might define outsiders here. With one of my collaborators recently, we've been looking particularly at gender, partly because that one is slightly easier to identify historically, retrospectively, though not always as easy as you might think. So we've been looking, for instance, at whether, when the Royal Society finally admitted women in 1945, the third column from the left, you can just about see some women in blue appearing. It's the first women being admitted to the society. We were looking to see, does this make some difference to the editorial practices? I think the point you should take from this graph is there were still very few women. We're looking, I've given you 1975 and 1985 just to give you a few more women. We're looking at about 30 women by that point in time. That means, fairly obviously, there were not very many female referees at the Royal Society in this period. Here's the data. Oops, sorry. I will get this working eventually. There's the data on women referees that we've managed to find in our 5-year samples. The numbers are not huge. You might be thinking that 1955 and 1965 are looking kind of healthy, but it turns out that virtually all of that is single-handedly the work of Kathleen Lonsdale, the crystallographer, who was an unusually active referee. In fact, unusual among male fellows as well as among female fellows. She did seem to do a lot of it. So very few papers by either men or women would be refereed by women, unless perhaps they were in crystallography when there were in fact 2 female fellows in that field. Now these numbers are so small that you won't be surprised that I can't do any statistical analysis of bias, acceptance or rejection bias against women. It's just not going to work. What we've been looking at instead is the tone and language in the referee reports and other editorial correspondence. And I'll just share a couple of examples that we've noted about the treatment that women received in the editorial process at the Royal Society. So for instance, it became common practice in the early 20th century that authors would be identified by their initials and surname, unless they were female, in which case they would be identified usually by their full first name, thus clearly identifying the gender of the author. But it wasn't just on the printed page. It was also happening in the referee process. You look at these referee reports, which were filled in by the Secretary of the Society when he sent them to the referees along with the manuscript, and you can very clearly see top left that Mrs. H. Ayrton is the author of that paper, and in the other one, Rosalind Franklin. So the gender is clear. In contrast, most referees' reports had initials. You can see A.G. McClellan in this, just very shortly after Rosalind Franklin's paper, and I have checked, and yes, I'm pretty confident that A.G. McClellan is male, or was, until his death. So we've got referees knowing not merely who the author is, but also what gender the person is. There are also some interesting examples of the microaggressions experienced by women fellows in this whole process. Take Kathleen Lonsdale, for instance. When she was an author for the Society, then she was clearly gendered female, because she appeared as Kathleen Lonsdale, or later as Dame Kathleen, but nonetheless clearly female. When, on the other hand, she acted as a referee, she would receive the standard form from the secretary saying, "Dear Sir," without scoring it out and correcting it. Now, so we can see ways in which women were treated differently in this process. I mean, none of it stopped some women being published, or indeed some foreigners and some junior scholars and other outsiders. What actually seems to be most significant, whether they got published by the Society, was whether they submitted in the first place. And so therefore I want to look at that second structural thing, the role of the communicator, the gatekeeping process. It was a long-standing tradition from at least the 18th century that papers would only be considered by the Society if they had been communicated by a fellow of the Society. And they could communicate on behalf of others. And as you saw from one of my earlier graphs, an increasing number of fellows were clearly doing that in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what you've got here is a system where you've got gatekeepers. And it is intentionally a system designed to work like that. It's an important filtering process for the Society, because it kept out the wrong sort of people, socially, and also the sorts of people who would submit such things as plans for perpetual motion machines, or descriptions of women giving birth to rabbits, or plans to square the circle. So gatekeeping, communicating, kept those papers out. And it was very successful. You remember that graph I showed you before? The red blocks at the top show you how many papers were not published. And it's actually a very small proportion. So over 90% of papers that had been accepted for consideration by the Society were ultimately published, because the gatekeeping, I would say, was so effective. This means that referees were generally working with an expectation that papers would be accepted. The decision was really, where shall they be published? Which of the journals shall they be published in? And could we make the paper any better? It's not really about, are we accepting it? Because we assume that it's come from another member of the Society. I probably trust that other member of the Society, so it's probably okay, roughly speaking. Of course, the problem with gatekeeping is that it might be rather too good at keeping papers out. So, for instance, I can't get the earlier figures on international location of authors. These are all 1950, 1960, 1970. But you won't be surprised that most authors were from Britain. It was, after all, a British society, and this is before the internet. So maybe that's not surprising. Women, very few of them as well. You can see just how small those numbers were. And that's despite the fact that the number of women scientists had been substantially growing since the 1890s, and despite the fact that since 1945 there were some women in the fellowship. We still don't see large numbers of women submitting to the Society. But it's not because there were rules saying women can't submit. Clearly some women did submit. Clearly some foreigners did submit. We can see this in the published papers. We've got school teachers, married women, colonial professors do all get published by the Society. The key thing here seems to be networks. Do they know somebody? Can they find somebody to submit their paper and help them through the process? So we have been trying to look at networks, and this is very early work. I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you a pretty picture. We haven't really started to analyze this yet because it's taken us quite a long time to build this network. But this is a picture of the connections between all authors, referees, and communicators in the early period that I'm talking about. We will also be doing it for some other periods, but haven't got there yet. The colors are discipline. One of the things this shows quite quickly is that the Royal Society had stronger networks in certain disciplines than in other disciplines. So the green is physics, for instance, but you have to look very closely to find any geology or any botany. We can also hopefully do some analysis on where people were in the network and how that affected their chances of success. One of the early things we've done is look at insiders and outsiders, who's who. This is the same network, but close up on the physics section of it, and coloured differently to show who was already a fellow, in orange, who never became a fellow. You probably can't see them because the dots are very small and they're blue. And all the green people who became a fellow. So in other words, you could move from being an outsider to becoming an insider. And that's quite interesting because publication was often part of the way in which you made that transition. So there's clearly some things we'll be able to do with that once we've had a little bit more time with the data. So now that you understand how this community worked, let's come back to my question about how it coped with the growth in scale. So how do we, a society that's got this very strict rule about only fellows being able to do the editorial work, and there's a limited number of those fellows, how do they cope when there's more and more papers coming in? So one thing that I see as a historian looking at this is that we seem to have a change in dynamic about the system that used to be run by fellows for fellows, or perhaps for people who are about to become fellows, changes to something that's much more like the members of an elite national body sitting in judgment on outsiders. But I haven't found anybody at the time talking about it in those terms. What I do find is people at the time complaining about this sort of thing. For mercy's sake, don't send me any more papers to referee for a long time. You know, if I get much more heavy refereeing like this, it's goodbye to any chance of doing real scientific work myself, especially given the sort of rubbish I've had to report on lately. So we're seeing a sense that some of the fellows feel they're under strain. There's too many referee reports needing to be written, they can't cope, and it's taking up too much time. Does any of this sound familiar at all? So one of the things we've been doing with data from the register papers is trying to look at that workload. So here is the average number of referee reports written by referees at the Royal Society per year. It goes up from about 1.5 reports a year to about 2.5 reports at the far end, though it's not a particularly pretty line. Given that the rise in submissions was ×3, that's actually not as big an increase as I had expected it to be, and certainly not as much as I thought it would be from that biochemist's remark that we just saw. Part of the reason for that is that more of the fellows were doing some refereeing work. This is the size of the fellowship, with the red is how many of them did any refereeing. And you can see that an increasing proportion of the fellows were doing some refereeing. And that's partly why the average workload doesn't increase as much as we might have expected. However, the other key point is that there was a huge variation, and I'll go back to this one, huge variation between the referees who did just one report, which is most of them, and the referees who did a lot of reports, which is people like Kathleen Lonsdale and various others, people who did 8, 9, 10 reports a year rather than one. And if you look at the 90% confidence intervals on that, look at the breadth of that blue band, and you see how it gets wider as we go across. So in other words, as more people are being involved in the refereeing process, the workload is actually becoming more unevenly distributed. We're getting more people involved, but more of them are just doing one report. We've still got a small number of people who are doing a lot of the work, and they now seem to be doing even more work, which is, I think, rather curious. So, you know, on the surface, we seem to have more people involved. It's a good thing, but it's not actually helping as much as we might have thought. So, by the point in time, by the time we get to those complaints from the biochemist, there were a number of criticisms of the Royal Society's entire system. Perhaps, in fact, the Royal Society should ditch this complex, convoluted, ponderous editorial system and rethink entirely. Some people thought refereeing was so old-fashioned by 1902 that it was an anachronism. Many people thought it was a cause of delay, quite rightly, I have to say, and also sometimes injustice. Other people accuse it of being conservative against new work, again with some cause, and of course the worry about the burden and whether it could be sustained. Others pointed a finger at the role of communicators, whether the communication system was still working effectively, both whether communicators were still doing their job properly, because some people thought the communicators were just being lazy and just forwarding anything, and thus the referees were having to do more work because the communicators weren't filtering out stuff. And other people worrying that perhaps there were maybe a few good scientists somewhere in the world who didn't work in the laboratory of a fellow of the Royal Society, and maybe they weren't submitting to the Society. But that wasn't until the 1970s they really started worrying about that. So you got some real worries about whether this system could continue any further. And you might just bear in mind that by the time we get to the 1950s, the post-war period, this is the rise of the commercial players in publishing. This is the rise of Pergamon Press and Elsevier and latterly Blackwell. So there's a lot of growth and expansion in scientific journals in the 1950s and 60s. And you can imagine why some of the learned societies, and not just the Royal Society incidentally, were starting to wonder what their role was in this new world. So that's also going on in the background. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there were a number of organizational changes just after the period that I've been looking at so far. So for instance, in 1968, the Society decided that you could actually have referees who were not fellows of the Society anymore. Quite a significant change for them, letting outsiders into the refereeing process. And in 1990, communicators were abolished as well, and you get direct submission to the editorial office Oh, and also you can choose your own form of name from 1990 onwards as well. Though that was actually about those men who didn't want to be, it was N, it was a Nick was the example. Could he possibly be Nicholas, or maybe even Nick, instead of having to be N? So change names. Now you could read this as demonstration that the closed, fellows-only, members-only editorial system couldn't, it had worked fine when the journals were for the fellows and by the fellows, but it couldn't work when the Society's ambition had become publishing all the best scientific research in the world, they hoped. So under tension, certainly. There is, I have to say, no evidence at all that this opening up of the editorial process was anything to do with concerns about diversity or bias or fairness. There's no evidence in the archive to support any of that. I have been looking for it. Rather, I think you have to say that the opening up of the editorial system looked more like an attempt to find a larger pool of referees to try and cope with that sense of overload and of burden. Did it work? Well, in a few more months' time, I'll have the data from 1970, 1975, 1980, and I might know the answer to that question. But what I can say already is that in terms of gender, no, it didn't, because we've actually found fewer women refereeing for the Society in the 1970s and 1980s than we did before, which is really quite odd when you consider that if the Society didn't have enough women in the Society, well, maybe they could look beyond. It makes one wonder if what we're seeing is, yes, we'll look beyond the walls of the Society, but we're still looking for people like us when we're looking. So there's some interesting things to talk about there, though perhaps not now. So, I wrote this slide ahead of time because I had to submit it in advance. What I actually want to say now is not quite the same as that, I think. Partly because of sitting through the sessions earlier. I can understand why the Royal Society in the late 20th century opened up its pool of referees beyond the fellowship. I can understand why it removed the gatekeeping role later on. I mean, the first of those presumably helped spread that workload. The second certainly helped in attracting submissions from a wider pool. And from a modern standpoint, we surely have to be pleased that the Society was no longer, and is no longer, operating a system that gave a homogeneous group of senior white British males so much power over editorial decision-making. But I do wonder still if something has been lost with the watering down of that sense of community behind the journal. Because if you want to talk about encouraging and motivating reviewers or rewarding them, you didn't have to do that so much when they were all part of a society and they kind of all felt they had to do it as part of their duty, and you didn't need motivation in quite the same sense. And also the question of shared norms about what counts as good research and what the appropriate tone is. If you've got a group of people who are socialized to share certain norms, that has some advantages in, I suppose, what we'd now call reviewer training. But I mean, given all the discussions that are currently going on about the problems of motivating reviewers, about inequalities in the community of global reviewers, the global north doing most of the work, and what about the global south, for instance? What about all the concerns about whether reviewers behave properly during the process, which is what a lot of the discussion about open peer review is actually about. Given all those concerns, I think that, I certainly hope that this historical case study gives us some food for thought and reflection about how earlier people had to deal with some slightly similar things. So I shall stop there and have some reflection, everybody, please. Oh, and thank much to all my collaborators. Thank you.
That was terrific. Terrific. I have to stop there because the single most important thing that people like about this Congress is that it goes along smartly. So you'll just have to run Professor Fyfe down and ask her your questions yourself.
Exactly. I thought it was good timing at the end of the day.
I've been asked by Annette, well, actually ordered by Annette, to say that Amy Price and Kathleen Berryman, are there either of them here? Stand up, wave. Well, congratulations. They went to staggering lengths to get here from Texas, and they got here. All we had in Oregon was vast forest fires and so on. Tomorrow morning, there's a plenary session beginning at 8 a.m. There will be a WAMI meeting, a business meeting at 7 a.m. here. Breakfast will also be served beginning at 7 a.m. The reception begins now in the lobby and the exhibit hall. That's it. Thank you very much, everybody.